This week, the price of Bitcoin has been a roller coaster. And while it may seem like there are so many questions left unanswered, in the end, the only real question is, when the dust settles, in the clarity of hindsight, who will be remembered as the April Fools?
This podcast is for information and entertainment purposes only. Nothing on this podcast should be construed as financial advice. All views expressed on this podcast are solely the opinions of the host and or any guests that we might have from time to time. Nothing on this podcast should be construed as a specific inducement to make a particular investment or to follow a particular investing strategy.
Guten Tag, Buenos Dias, Morgen, and welcome to episode 210 of the Bitcoin Bulletin Podcast. As I mentioned in the intro, this week has certainly been a roller coaster, not only with the price of Bitcoin, but with the news, with the weather. There's some pretty brutal weather working its way across other parts of the United States this evening. So if you're up in the Mississippi River Valley where the tornadoes are lashing, our thoughts and prayers are certainly with you. Hope you come out of this okay. But you know, the weather here in Florida, it feels like it's summer officially. I mean, this has been the first real tropical feeling day in a while. You know, it was in the mid 80s, which is nowhere near as hot as it gets. I mean, we'll get almost to 100 in the summer, upper 90s, 95, 96 degrees will be a regular occurrence in July or in August. But last night I went for a walk around the neighborhood after midnight and it was still in the 80 degree range and the humidity was 88%. So it was just hot, humid, soggy. It was just a casual stroll. I wasn't working out or exercising, but I came home just dripping just from all the water in the air. And I guess that's normal for Florida, but I'd kind of gotten used to the cool winter we've had the last several months. We've had cold front after cold front. And there have been times when I had to bring my orchids inside because I was worried it was going to get cold enough to damage them. So we went from brisk, cool evenings in the 50 degree range to the lows in the mid 70s now. And it looks like we're going to be riding out that kind of weather for the remainder of 2025. But that's okay. That's why we're here, because we hate the cold. That's why I live in Florida. One of the sadder things that has happened this week was the passing of one of my favorite actors, Val Kilmer. And it seems fitting that he passed on April Fool's Day because many of his iconic roles were playing a wisecracking, mischievous character. Obviously, he had the more serious roles like Iceman and Top Gun, but even in Tombstone, which was a serious Western, you know, about the shootout at the OK Corral where he played Doc Holliday. He played the wisecracking Doc Holliday. I mean, he was deadpan. He did it with a straight face, but it was the comic relief in that movie for sure. But his first two films were Top Secret and Real Genius, and those just happen to be two of my favorite movies of all time. Top Secret is easily the most quoted movie amongst my friend group. Just so many great lines from that movie. If you haven't seen Top Secret, it's a comedy that makes fun of the World War II and spy era generation where he plays Nick Rivers, an American rock and roll star, who all of his songs are about guns. It's pretty funny. But they're like Beach Boy spoofs or Elvis spoofs, just about skeet surfing instead of, you know, Surfing USA, for example. And then his second movie was Real Genius, where he played, he played a college student who was a genius working on a laser. And it had its serious moments as well, but it was also solidly a comedy with Val Kilmer bringing almost all of the comic relief in that movie. So fitting that he passed on April Fool's Day, but gone too soon. So R.I.P. Val Kilmer. Speaking of April Fool's Day, I mean, everybody should know what April Fool's Day is because pretty much everywhere in the world celebrates April Fool's Day. It's not an American holiday by any means, but it does have a pretty rich, if not murky history for those who may not be familiar with the concept of April Fool's Day. Nobody really knows how April Fool's Day began, but there are several prevailing theories that attribute it to a mix of historical events or seasonal changes and cultural traditions. And one of the most widely accepted theories ties April Fool's Day to the adoption of the Gregorian calendar in 1582 under Pope Gregory XIII. Before then, most of Europe followed the Julian calendar, where the new year began around late March or early April, often coinciding with the spring equinox. And when they had the big switchover, France, for instance, switched to the Gregorian calendar and that moved New Year's Day to January 1st, obviously. And those who didn't adapt or were pranked into thinking the old date still applied were often marked as quote unquote April Fools. So this shift, while plausible, isn't universally documented as the origination, the sole origin anyway, of April Fool's Day, but um, some historians dismiss it as merely a convenient story more than a definitive cause, even though we saw the term April Fools really originate in that era. However, another theory traces the day back to ancient Rome and their celebration of Hilaria, which was held around late March, and it involved merriment, disguises, and playful mockery, elements that echo modern April Fool's Day traditions. And then, of course, in medieval Europe, we had the Feast of Fools, where we saw the lower clergy and lay people subvert the norms by dressing up, mocking authority, and engaging in absurd antics. And this typically happened around early January, but it was sometimes linked to spring festivities. One thing is for certain, by the 18th and 19th centuries, April Fool's Day was firmly entrenched in Western culture. In Britain, it became a day for elaborate hoaxes. An example was the 1698 prank where Londoners were tricked into coming out to watch the washing of the lions at the Tower of London, an event that, of course, never happened. And Scotland developed its own twist with the hunting of the gawk, which was a bird, kind of like snipe hunting here in the United States, where people were basically sent on fake errands. Across the pond here in the USA, American newspaper and later media outlets often embraced the tradition, with famous examples like the spaghetti tree hoax. And I guess that was more of a traditional, that was more of a BBC thing. But today, April Fool's Day is a global phenomenon, and it blends local customs with a universal love of mischief. So whether it's for corporations staging fake product launches or friends pulling lighthearted stunts, the day absolutely thrives on suspense and hopefully a little bit of laughter. While its exact roots remain a bit of a historical prank itself, which is kind of fitting, its evolution reflects humanity's enduring appetite for a good joke. And there were certainly a lot of good jokes. If you're a player of War Thunder, they had the April Fool's Day event where you got to drive around and fly around in World War I vehicles, including the Zeppelin, which will not make it into the actual game, but they always do something entertaining for April Fool's Day. But perhaps one of the biggest fails, and this isn't necessarily Bitcoin related, but one of the biggest fails for April Fool's Day pranks on the corporate side was In-N-Out Burger, seemingly mocking pro-Bitcoin Steak and Shake by tweeting, "It's official. In-N-Out will be transitioning to 100% pure beef tallow. The change is set to become effective on May 1st, 2025 at all In-N-Out locations." And they had to follow that up with a comment saying this is obviously an April Fool's Day prank, because so many people were excited because it should be obvious to you as a Bitcoiner that there's a trend towards eating healthier and getting rid of seed oils, and to be so tone deaf that they would think this would be funny to announce that they're going to be doing something great that everyone's excited about, and not for people to get it as a gag. It's like, haha, we're mocking Steak and Shake with their transitioning to beef tallow for their French fries in the last month or so. Was just an epic fail. But in general, I usually advise most of my friends to just stay off social media on April Fool's Day, because even if you're really quick and you're really on your A game, it's so easy to forget what day it is, especially with time changes. April Fool's Day starts in England and Europe when it's still, the March 31st here in the United States. And even here on the East Coast of Florida, it's April Fool's Day at midnight, but in California, it's still, 9 PM. So there can be a little bit of just forgetting what day it is. And sometimes the pranks are maddening or humiliating. And I just try to avoid social media in general on April Fool's Day. We do have a lot of Bitcoin news to talk about today, not the least of which is the price action. But before we do, let's take our customary look at Bitcoin's vital statistics. At the time of this recording, we are sitting at a block height of 890,630, and Bitcoin is ringing in at $82,740 US, down almost exactly $4,000 from last DCA Wednesday and $6,000 from just earlier today, albeit ever so briefly. But that means that every US dollar that we convert into Bitcoin is going to score us 1,209 sats. So more than 50 sats per dollar than we got last DCA Wednesday. And so that makes me happy. Many, many, many times you've heard me and other people parrot the fact that it's that when the price goes up, they start to get worried that you haven't stacked hard enough. Even people that have been in for years. OGs. I mean, we've been doing this podcast for almost 4 years now, and I've been in Bitcoin a wee bit longer than that. And even I started getting a little bit nervous, thinking I wasn't going to make my newest stacking goal, that it would be a heck of a lot harder. I mean, if Bitcoin had accelerated to $250,000 per Bitcoin now, that means we'd be getting a third, basically, of the Satoshis for the money we're gonna convert today, that we're going to get today. So I am happy to stack as long at low prices, relatively low prices. I say low prices, $82,000, man. Can you imagine? I mean, it wasn't even a year ago that $82,000 would have been just a dream. This would have been the moon. This would have been a new all-time high, until it wasn't. So it's amazing how Bitcoin changes your perspective, especially when it comes to price. But the point being, we're going to be able to stack more sats. And that makes me happy, because I have an unofficial stacking goal for this podcast, and stacking only 1,000 sats per dollar is a lot harder to reach than back just only a year ago when we were getting almost 4,000 sats per dollar. Not even a year ago in many cases. Once again, I'm getting off on a tangent, so back along the vital statistics. Bitcoin's current price gives it a market capitalization of 1.64 trillion US dollars. Again, we tend to view Bitcoin through the lens of that $2 trillion market cap now, but I remind you, we only saw 2 trillion market cap for 3 DCA Wednesdays, and not in a row. We saw it on the DCA Wednesday back on December 11th, and then we had 2 in a row on January 22nd and January 29th. We were over 2 trillion, but you don't have to scroll that far back before Bitcoin broke the $1 trillion market cap for the first time. In fact, a year ago, this time, Bitcoin was over 1 trillion, but you only have to go back to February of last year. So just a little over a year, when we were talking only 872 billion for a market cap, and then only 777 billion at the end of January of last year. So again, that's one of those things where Bitcoin changes you, and not necessarily always in good ways. It can make you feel that FOMO, and you get used to those all-time high prices, and then it makes you feel like Bitcoin is down, when actually Bitcoin is coming in at a staggering 82,740 US dollars. I mean, I remember several cycles ago when Bitcoin first hit 20,000 for the first time in 2017, and everybody was thinking that was the moon. Now, could you imagine if Bitcoin hit $20,000? If Bitcoin goes down to $40,000, people will be calling Bitcoin over, when, it's less than a decade since that would have been an all-time high. So again, I digress, but keep in mind that you're in this for the long term. When we first started this podcast, we used to say that you shouldn't, well, we used to say a couple of things that people don't tend to say anymore, like never invest any money you can't afford to lose. But most importantly, never convert any money to Bitcoin that you needed to spend on groceries. And at the time, you couldn't spend Bitcoin on pretty much anything. It's a little easier now, but the idea was you don't want to have to sell your Bitcoin to pay your rent. So you should be only putting basically your spare money, your long-term investment money that you can tuck away and forget about for 10 plus years into Bitcoin. And while people are getting off zero to where there are people out there fully living on Bitcoin, like Jack Mallers gets his paycheck in Bitcoin, owns Strike, of course, so it's easier for him. But for those of us that are getting on zero instead of getting off zero, it's a little bit harder to keep an open mind, that long-term mindset, when you have bills that you're going to pay tomorrow and you're going to be paying in Bitcoin. But once again, I digress. It's one of the reasons we don't try and time the markets here. One of the reasons why I started DCA Wednesday with this podcast series, because, instead of trying to time the markets, we've just been buying slowly but surely every Wednesday, and we've got a fairly decent size stack now, and we are in at a really good purchase price on average compared to what the current price of Bitcoin is, even with the price retracing a little bit into the $80,000 range. And that was by using dollar cost averaging instead of trying to time the market. So if you're trying to time the market, you probably got absolutely wrecked today, especially if you're doing so with leverage, which is it's another thing that we say never do, because as far as I'm concerned, leverage is 100% gambling, especially if you can't afford to pay the bill when you get wrecked, when you get liquidated. That's just nuts. For those of you who continue to value your wealth in shiny yellow rocks, it will currently cost you 26.3 ounces of gold to purchase just one Bitcoin. Gold is pretty much a new all-time record high today. And I want to point out, and I've said this before, gold has been considered the original store value for thousands of years, the hedge against inflation for thousands of years. And the reason why is not entirely because of its rarity. The reason why gold is a hedge against inflation is because it's a commodity that's in demand. And when you have inflation, it's not the price of goods going up. Obviously, you know this. It's the value of your money going down. So it takes more of your money to buy those commodities. And that includes gold. Gold is going to get more expensive, just like your eggs got more expensive, just like the dollar venue, the 99-cent chicken sandwich you used to get now is a $7 chicken sandwich at so many places. Why you could spend $1,000, on just one night out when you're on vacation, with between your hotel room and your meals for a family of four, when you used to be able to take an entire vacation for $1,000. It's because the money is worth less, so it takes more of it to buy it. The value of a hotel room didn't go up, and the value of your chicken McNuggets didn't go up, just like the value of gold, when adjusted for inflation, isn't booming at all, especially when you compare it to Bitcoin. So right now, with the price of everything going up and seeing a little bit of a retracement back in the price of Bitcoin, we have some of those gold bugs dancing and doing the jig. But remember, if you look at, if you bought 1 ounce of gold in like the 1990s when it was $300 an ounce, congratulations. In the last 35 years, you've 10x'd your money. That isn't even keeping up with inflation, and it certainly isn't even keeping up with what Bitcoin does in just an average cycle. If we hit 150,000 this cycle, that will have 10x'd from the cycle low just in one cycle. And you compare that to gold taking 35 years to do the same. So again, a tangent, a related tangent, but a tangent nonetheless. For those of you who value your wealth in pizza, one Bitcoin will currently purchase you 4,627 large pepperoni pizzas for Papa John's. Again, just like gold, you're going to get a few less pizzas for your Bitcoin this week than you did last week. Again, zoom out, look at the big picture. The price of Bitcoin can be volatile. We all know that. And that should be one of the first things you noticed about Bitcoin, is that until we reach hyper Bitcoinization and everyone has Bitcoin and Bitcoin's in everyday use, while people are scrambling for those last million Bitcoin that'll ever be mined, there's going to be volatility. And that goes, for the upside as well as for the downside. And right now we're looking at a little bit of downside volatility. Actually, we saw both upside and downside volatility today, but we'll get into that in the news. All right, that metric that has been my favorite for most of this podcast, Bitcoin's 24-hour average transaction rate, is down significantly from last week. Last week, we were seeing an average of 6.14 transactions per second on chain, and right now we're looking at an average of 4.74 transactions. Back in the day, that would have been considered healthy on-chain activity, but again, things about Bitcoin change rapidly, and when they do, they change your perspective. When we first started this podcast, we used to say pi. If we saw more than 3.14 transactions per second, the price of Bitcoin was usually booming. And then, with the bloat, the spam, the BRC20 tokens, the orders and inscriptions clogging up the mempool, we saw fees go up, and there's still a little bit of that. Plus, with Bitcoin adoption comes more activity, and with more activity comes more mempool bloat, including increase in on-chain fees, but obviously increase in average transactions per second. So the metric still holds. We've seen almost a 30% decrease in the average transaction rate over last week, and the price of Bitcoin has come down. So again, that I'm not a TA guy. You know that if you've listened to at least one episode of this podcast already, but just in my casual observation, that's been fun to take notice of. And as one might expect, with the decrease in activity, the mempools are just about clear right now. We've seen them clear out and stay pretty much clear for the last several days. Of course, last DCA Wednesday, there were 24,000 transactions in Clark Moody's dashboard's mempool. Right now, there's only 1,803. That wouldn't even fill up the next block if it comes pretty quickly. And it's been 9 minutes between blocks, so there's likely that one will be coming any minute now. Mempool.space is showing 1,832 transactions in their mempool as well, so pretty much in agreement with Clark Moody's dashboard that mempools are really clear right now. And that is cool because that means fees are cheap. And when fees are cheap, that's a good time to consolidate some UTXOs. If you're thinking about maybe moving some of your Bitcoin to a multi-sig setup, now's the time to do it. If you're thinking about opening or closing some Lightning channels, those are on-chain transactions as well. So now's the time to do that. I definitely did some channel management last night, opened a brand new channel I'd been wanting to open for a long time, and rebalanced some of my other channels. And I did so for 1 sat per VByte. And speaking of those on-chain fees, Clark Moody's dashboard is still recommending 3 sats per VByte for a priority transaction. I think that's just like last week. I think that's a little conservative. That's erring in the side of caution because I'm scrolling back through all the blocks I can see looking at mempool.space without scrolling too far. All include at least a handful of 1 sat per VByte transactions. Of course, Clark Moody's mempool or Clark Moody's dashboard is saying that if you have a little while to wait, a 1 sat per VByte transaction will clear within a day. Mempool.space is saying any transaction, whether it's a high priority, medium priority, low priority, or no priority transaction, only needs a 1 sat per VByte fee. And plebs, that works out to just 12 cents in US dollar terms. Think about the power to send theoretically an unlimited amount of value anywhere in the world, right? And there's only ever going to be 21 million Bitcoin. So theoretically, if you had all 21 million Bitcoin, there was a limit to how valuable they can be at any given US dollar value. But run with me here on this. Functionally, you and I can send any amount of money that we would ever dream about sending to anyone, anywhere, if we had it, for just 12 cents. And that we could do that with finality, almost instant settlement within 10 minutes, couple of blocks worth of transaction security in less than an hour. And we can do that and nobody can stop us. Nobody can tell us we can't do it. Nobody can revoke the transaction, claw it back, or divert it. We can do all of that for just 12 cents right now per VByte. That's pretty cool. All right. We are getting closer to the next Bitcoin difficulty adjustment. For those of you just joining us, or maybe not quite as technical as some of the other people listening to the podcast, the Bitcoin protocol adjusts how difficult it is to find a Bitcoin block every 2016 blocks. And that works out in theory to about every 2 weeks. Of course, blocks come in randomly, so that's why they take an average of 2016 blocks, and the protocol then decides whether blocks are coming in too fast or too slow, with the goal of having a block coming in on average of once every 10 minutes. And if they're coming in too fast, which is usually the case as Bitcoin adoption increases and more power is dedicated to mining the Bitcoin blockchain, then it gets more difficult. And of course, there are those times when, for whatever reason, the hash power, the computing power, slows down a bit. It takes a little bit longer to find a block. And if that's the case, then the difficulty's relaxed a little bit. But in general, we've been looking, if you zoom out, we've been looking at hash power going up and to the right and difficulty going up and to the right. For example, when Bitcoin was first launched, you could mine easily on a laptop. And then it wasn't too long before people were making rigs out of multiple GPUs, and those lasted just a blink of an eye. And then we came out with the first specialized ASIC miners, which have only gotten more and more powerful. I remember when I first got into Bitcoin, seriously, when I first started contemplating mining, you already needed an ASIC, and pretty much state-of-the-art ASIC around that point in time was the Antminer S7, which might clock in at about 1 terahash if you had the Antminer S7, and then that was eclipsed by the Antminer S9, and those models ranged about 4 to 4.1 terahash depending on which generation of the S9, and then the S19 that was over 100 terahash, and you get the picture. The computing power, the ability to mine Bitcoin, the miners, the ASICs have gotten more and more powerful, and more people have added them to the network. There's still plenty of old miners out there where there's free energy or cheap energy or stranded energy. So in addition to more miners, the miners in general are getting more powerful by the day. So along those lines, In about 442 blocks, we're going to have another halving. That's going to be sometime around April 5th. And it's looking like that's going to be a fairly sizable difficulty adjustment. Anything can happen in the next 442 blocks, especially with the price dipping. Maybe some people turn off their miners. But right now, we're looking at an increase of anywhere between 3.01% to 4.1%, depending where I get my data. And that is because blocks right now are averaging, during this epoch, they are averaging 9 minutes and 37 seconds. So unless that changes, we're going to see a relatively sizable increase to try and slow those blocks down a bit and bring them in closer to that 10-minute average. Before we get to the news, I want to take a minute to thank those of you listening on your favorite Podcasting 2.0 apps, such as Fountain. Podcasting 2.0 allows you to support this podcast through the value for value method by either streaming sats as you listen on a minute-by-minute basis, or by sending a boost, which is a shout-out via a Lightning transaction. And since it is a Lightning transaction, regardless of what you want to say, you're sending some Satoshis along to help support the podcast, contribute value back for the value you feel you're receiving by listening. And we do have a boost to read, and the boost is from longtime supporter Leggy. Leggy boosted 3,000 sats and says, "Hi there. Why are all my favorite podcasters named Chris and all my favorite YouTubers named Matt?" ? And a little smiley face. "Writing English is becoming hard for me because since 3 weeks, I'm learning French every day. And in my age, there seems to be a limited amount for language. Thanks." Well, thank you, Leggy. And I feel your pain because, I only ever formally learned English, obviously growing up. The only second language I formally learned was German. I took that in high school and in college. And of course, I went to Germany to visit some relatives and spent about a month there when I was a bit younger. So that was the language that I spent dedicated the most time to learning. But then later on in life, particularly growing up in the southwestern United States with a lot of Hispanic friends some of them had family members that didn't speak English. Their mothers, fathers, or grandparents that only spoke Spanish. But then later, I was in a career that required me to interact constantly with people who spoke either very limited English or only Spanish. And so I just picked up Spanish. I never took a single Spanish class. I'm looking back to see if maybe there was like a one-day training with like useful phrases. I can't even think of anything formal. I took so much training in that job that all kinds of blurs together. So maybe there was some sort of training on certain things that you might need to say routinely over and over again, or how to get information out of somebody that you need, like, "Hey, what is your name?" Simple stuff. But I don't think I did. But as I started picking up Spanish, I started losing my ability to complete a sentence in German. So I feel your pain, Leggy. It's in a humorous way. It kind of reminds me of the TV show Married with Children back in the 90s. I don't know if most of the people listening to this podcast might not even be old enough to have been remembering TV in the 90s, early 90s, or if they even watched that TV show. But Married with Children was a sitcom, and one of the characters was played by Christina Applegate. And there's an episode where the theme is that she's trying to memorize a whole bunch of facts because she's going to audition for a game show, a quiz show or whatever, a TV show. And she wants to know all the answers so that she can ace the audition and get on TV. But she reaches the capacity limit for her brain. So every time she learns a new fact, she forgets something, like forgetting how to tie her shoes. I mean, really basic stuff. And it's kind of amusing, but I feel it, and it isn't just as I'm starting to get a little older. When you're a kid, it seems like you know it all when you're a kid, right? Especially when you're a teenager. But when you're younger, in your 20s and 30s, you're sharp as a tack. And naturally, some of that fades with age. But I'm not that old. I'm certainly not a boomer, not yet. But I can feel it that certainly when it comes to languages. And I used to joke that they say in the United States there's an unofficial language called Spanglish. We certainly have that in Florida, especially in Miami. Where the Cuban refugee community oftentimes will be speaking a fluent mix of English and Spanish, just flip-flopping words back and forth. And I have apparently Germish now because I can't spit out a sentence in German without hashing up with Spanish. And I have the distinct feeling that Leggy is indicating that is the similar thing where they have the tendency to throw a French word in there when you're trying to type out English. Either way, Leggy, I can tell you 100% that your English is better than both my German and my Spanish, and certainly better than my French, because I speak very little French. So once again, thank you for the boost. It's always great to hear from you. Always entertaining. Always something really cool to share. So thank you. Thank you for the boost. And thank you to everyone listening regardless of where you're listening from and regardless of whether or not you feel that you can contribute value back with your precious Satoshis, because I know when you're trying to stack, the thought of parting with Satoshis can be a tough one to make. I try to support as many businesses as I can that accept Bitcoin by spending Bitcoin. I'm waiting for Steak and Shake to spend Bitcoin. Speaking of, we talked about Steak and Shake and In-N-Out Burger a little bit just a minute ago. And we'll talk about Steak and Shake a little bit more in the news section. But the point being, I want to support those businesses that do accept Bitcoin. And I know how hard it is to part with my sats. In fact, I usually don't. Either I spend and replace, or I tend to use Strike, where you have a debit card. I have a certain amount of US dollars on my debit card linked to Strike. And so if I need to pay $30 at Steak and Shake when they start accepting Bitcoin, it'll come $30 will come out of my checking account, but they'll get Satoshis and they won't know the difference. All they know is they got paid in Bitcoin. And that's really what I'm going for. Again, another tangent. But speaking of our listeners, our geographic distribution of listeners has remained the same, with the minor exception that Singapore has increased their percentage. They remain at the same spot in the top 10, but must be a few more listeners in Singapore because they shot up the top 10. I'm getting ahead of myself, but they entered the top 10 a couple of months ago, and then they blasted all the way up to almost the top. And while they're still in the same position, they went from around 10%, from less than 10% of our listenership to now more than 10% of our listenership. And I think they increased by about 7% just since last DCA Wednesday. So that's pretty cool. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. Our top 10 countries for listeners remain as follows. Number 1 remains the United States of America, where still more than 50% of you are listening from. So hello and thank you to all my fellow Americans. Hopefully you are not sitting in the path of all the tornadoes that are getting ready to roar or have been roaring across the Mississippi Valley, heading towards Kentucky. I know I have friends that are directly in the path in Western Kentucky. So fingers crossed, thoughts and prayers for everybody who may be affected by that tonight. But thank you for taking the time to listen to this podcast, especially if you're hunkered down riding out the storm. Number 2, as I was talking about, remains Singapore, who has increased their percent of listenership by about an additional 7%, coming in solidly number 2. So apa kabar? Thank you to those of you listening in Singapore, especially those of you who might be listening for the first time, since it looks like we're increasing our listenership in Singapore. Number 3 remains Germany, where they have been for almost the entire history of this podcast. So Dankeschön, mein Freunds in Deutschland. Number 4 remains Argentina. So muchos gracias, amigos. Thank you for listening in numbers sufficient to keep you in not only the top 10, but the top 5. Number 5 remains Luxembourg. So again, Dankeschön, mein Freunds in Luxembourg, or Morien, to those of you speaking Luxembourgish. Number 6 remains Canada. Hopefully this winter is ending soon for you in Canada. I know it's pretty cold north of here. I was watching a snowstorm move across a friend's webcam in Minnesota, and it was pretty cold and icy in Minnesota. In Canada, if you're north of Minnesota, I imagine it's even colder. So hello and thank you to those of you listening in Canada. Number 7 remains the United Kingdom. So hello and thank you to our cousins across the pond. Number 8 remains Australia. So hello and thank you to those of you down under in Australia. And number 9 remains Spain. So hola, muchas gracias, amigos in Spain. And number 10, rounding out the top 10, remains Mexico. I need to get back to Mexico before it gets too hot. I know in the tropics it's always hot, but I keep telling myself I'm going to go down to Playa del Carmen or Tulum. And last time I was down there was in the end of March, and it was just brutal. And if I could seem to get there in like December or January, it's just a little bit nicer. So I need to get back to Mexico soon. But in the meantime, hola, muchas gracias, amigos in Mexico. And that rounds out the top 10. But again, thank you to everyone listening, regardless of where you're listening from. We have listeners pretty much in any country that I could think of. I tried to name a country that wasn't in my top 10 and scroll through, and sure enough, it was there. Every country I could think of. So that is both humbling and flattering that so many of you around the world. I know Bitcoin is for everyone. It's not just for people in the United States, obviously, but it's flattering that people all around the world value this podcast enough to spend some of their time listening into the Bitcoin Bulletin Podcast. So once again, thank you all from the bottom of my heart. On to the news. Of course, it seems like whether it's a bull market or a bear market, price dominates the news. And that's because normies care about price. And until we get to hyper Bitcoinization, most people, even people that try to be on a Bitcoin standard, still have to deal with a world that values things in US dollars. So I can understand the importance. It certainly is symbolic that we're getting closer to hyper Bitcoinization as the price of Bitcoin surges. And sometimes it feels like, that we're not doing so well in that battle when the price of Bitcoin is slipping. I do want to say there's a lot of people out there for more than a couple weeks now that have been saying that this cycle is over. We've already peaked. This bull run is done. Stick a fork in it. And even more so after today. And I would like to say that even to me, psychologically, sometimes this feels a lot like the bust part of the previous Bitcoin cycles. But I can tell you that's one of the many reasons I know it's not. Because each of the previous cycles I've lived through, nobody's been able to identify the top. And every time we've been in the bear market, there's been one or two people heckling that, maybe that when price is going up, it's just a dead cat bounce. But there's still just so much hopium in the first month or two after we do, in hindsight, you'll never know what the end of the cycle was until the peak of the cycle was until hindsight. And when you do, you look back at the month or two after we hit whatever the ultimate all-time high for the cycle is. And there's just total disbelief that the price isn't still going up. There's maybe some of that's hopium, maybe some of it's shock, some of it's denial. But the things that we didn't see when the price started retracing in the last few days, we had people immediately throwing in the towel, saying, "That's it. I'm taking my ball and going home. Pack up the bags. It's over." That's just not how the psychology works. When you have the hype cycle, the euphoria cycle, there's so much euphoria. Even people like Matt Odell, who coined the whole "stay humble and stack sats" thing, was calling 200-day by conference day, in 2017. And of course, we never even got 100,000, and we peaked at 69,000. So even people like Odell were making price predictions and telling people to smash buy at the top. So that's not what we've been seeing this time around. We don't have that level of hopium, that level of euphorium, that level of FOMO kicking in, even amongst seasoned OG Bitcoiners. So, and again, I've said that if you look at the previous cycles, we shouldn't have even set a new all-time high now. Maybe we should have eclipsed the previous all-time high, I guess, but not blasted significantly beyond it like we have. And another reason that this cycle, I think, hasn't even begun yet is because it's just counterintuitive for the price to be trending down other than a retracement. And we have retracements all the time. Every bull run, I said we have five. I said numerous times we have 5 to 7 pullbacks because that's how price discovery works. But for it to be over already, I mean, Bitcoin going into the cycle has the best macro setup that any cycle has ever had for the history of Bitcoin. Even before the strategic Bitcoin reserve, the Overton window didn't just shift, but was thrown completely wide open, during the campaign when RFK Jr. and then Donald Trump, before RFK, threw his weight behind Donald Trump when he was running as an independent, came out and openly campaigned as a pro-Bitcoiner, as a pro-Bitcoin president. And Donald Trump kind of got on that bandwagon shortly thereafter. But remember, RFK was out there first, and that makes sense because he's a little more libertarian, in more with the libertarian crowd than he comes from a big, powerful Democratic family, but clearly he's the libertarian in the family. So we had the presidential campaign hinging potentially on Bitcoiners this time around. Then we had the SEC, of course, was sued into reversing course and then subsequently approving the Bitcoin ETFs. And we've seen a dramatic increase in institutional adoption, not just, the ETFs, but and not just ETFs or companies like MicroStrategy stacking more and more Bitcoin, or companies joining MicroStrategy or pension funds, et cetera. But, the innovation, I think we're just starting to see the innovation amongst the traditional financial system start to come online. Clearly, this is something that was stifled by Operation Choke Point 2.0 and by the anti-crypto presidency that we had before and by Elizabeth Warren. Because if you remember, 4 years ago, banks were getting ready to launch Bitcoin custody. They had Bitcoin products. Every bank had their own blockchain. Some banks had their own token. Remember JP Morgan coin? And all of that just went away. It got mothballed is what it did. And so now with the repeal of SAB 121, surely some of that is going to be rolled back out in the not too distant future, and that will continue to pour gasoline onto the bullfire. So what I'm getting at is you could not ask for a more bullish scenario than what we have. So what gives? My hypothesis is twofold. One, we always have pullbacks, 5 to 7 of them every bull run, and some of those pullbacks are steeper than what we've seen. We're only 20-something% down from the all-time high, and previous halvings have all had multiple pullbacks below greater than 30%. They're upwards to almost 40% pullbacks. A couple, like I talked about last podcast, that were 4, 5, 38% pullbacks in the last bull run. But I would hypothesize that the other thing is that one of the things that's extremely different this bull run is that we'd never had such a massive pump prior to the halving before. This time we had the big ETF pump when the ETFs were approved and went live. We set a fresh all-time high even before the halving. So that was certainly different than where we started previous halvings. And then, of course, we had the so-called Trump pump after his election and his inauguration. So while it may seem like Bitcoin is quote-unquote crashed, I would argue that we are significantly ahead of where we would normally be at this point in an average cycle. So logically, after those pumps, there was going to be a time of consolidation. And you couple that with the fact that we normally see consolidation and retracements during the price discovery of a normal bull cycle, every cycle, that I'd say that that this is just a normal, healthy period for Bitcoin, and that in hindsight, we're all going to realize that. I also want to remind you that, again, that face melting euphoria phase of the previous cycles normally doesn't get rolling until more than a year after halving. So using the previous halving cycles as a guide, we wouldn't expect things to start to get really crazy until later this summer, maybe even not till like late summer, end of July, beginning of August, stretching into the fall. So along those lines, remember to keep that low time preference. Sit back, relax, enjoy the ride, because it's still coming. We're still on the roller coaster at the beginning, where it's slowly creeping towards that first hill that we're going to climb. And as they say, stay humble and stack those sats. Speaking of staying humble, this has been one of my pet peeves on Twitter or X for the longest time, is every time Bitcoin moves, somebody, and Bitcoin Magazine is particularly bad about this, always puts breaking, Bitcoin hits whatever $1,000 US. And I saw Bitcoin Magazine do that twice today. Breaking, Bitcoin hits 86,000, and then breaking, Bitcoin hits 88,000. And before I could even open a browser to see what the price of Bitcoin was, it was already back down to 86. 88,000 was so short-lived. So, I mean, that I feel like you should probably, if you're gonna do that, I don't think you should do that anyway. That it's not breaking news that Bitcoin is 88,000, was 88,000 earlier today. But if you must, can you at least wait a minute or two before you hit post, before you hit send on that post? Because quite frankly, I think you guys jinxed it. That's just nuts. But Bitcoin did do a wild ride today, swinging up to as high as almost 89,000. I think it was 88,600 or so. And then to where we are now, which is actually a loss for the day. The other big news, and what people are blaming for the financial markets, is the announcement of the United States tariffs that they have been planning on unveiling against pretty much the entire world. A little bit of background. Almost every country, if you're a business in the United States and you want to sell your product, either there are laws that say you flat out can't, like certain products that can't be imported into France, or champagne can't be called champagne unless it's from the Champagne region of France. So that's why we have bubbly or sparkling wine in the United States. But every country imposes shockingly large tariffs on the United States. And the United States, in large part, doesn't. And even the tariffs that Donald Trump unveiled today were approximately 50% of what the reciprocating country was imposing on the United States. So, for example, there are countries that impose a 90% tariff on U.S. goods, and Donald Trump's only imposing a 43% tariff. Or if the tariff's 20% against the United States is only proposing a 10% tariff. I'm quite frankly shocked that when he said he was going to impose reciprocal tariffs, they weren't flat out just that. We're going to charge you whatever you charge us. But nonetheless, we saw a wave of media reporting that this was tanking the markets, with Yahoo Finance reporting the headline, NVIDIA TSMC chip stocks fall on sweeping reciprocal tariffs. The irony being they have tickers right below the headline that shows TSM up plus 1.04% for the day. Another headline from Bloomberg, same deal. Apple stock slides after tariffs threaten to hit production hubs. right under it, the ticker for Apple, which is up 0.31% for the day. The next comes from Yahoo Finance saying Walmart, Target, Nike shares drop on Trump's global tariffs. And then it shows Walmart up 1.05% for the day. I just found that kind of amusing. And, Donald Trump's been president for January 20th, so a little over 2 months now. And pretty much he hasn't had a chance to do anything that would affect the market either in a positive way or a negative way, other than like hope. Like, clearly with Bitcoin, getting rid of SAB 121 should have had immediate effects, but things that are going to change the global trade deficit and the global markets, they take time. That things like recessions lag. So if we went slamming into a recession right now, it would be the result of things that happened 18 months to 2 years previously. But the media hates Donald Trump. He is not going to get credit for any good things that happen, but he is sure as hell going to get blamed for every bad thing that happens. I want to remind you that this was back a month ago. Wall Street Mav tweeted, now that Biden is gone, all of the economic data from 2024 is being revised to show what really happened. It turns out the economy was lousy in 2024. They simply lied about it. I've spoken about this. Remember, they kept coming out with statistics to show that we're in the greatest economy in 50 years, that no Thanksgiving had ever been cheaper. Even the original Thanksgiving with the Pilgrims cost the Pilgrims more in a dollar adjusted terms than it would have this Thanksgiving, and that it was all just BS. And the media towed the line hand in glove, but they're not pointing out the fact that all these statistics, all the jobs numbers, all the economic data is being revised downward. They memory hold the fact that they completely rewrote the definition of what a recession is, because we would have technically been in a recession already 2 years ago. But by changing the definition, they said, congratulations, we're not in a recession. And the media didn't so much as question that. Briefly, you probably heard it reported, but nobody ever called BS on it. I want to remind you, this sort of crap is going to get worse, but in the opposite direction. Instead of the media lying, carrying water for the previous administration, we're going to have the media doing everything they can to make you feel miserable, and quite frankly, to drive things like the stock market down, because they can fud certain things down, like the price of stocks, to some extent. Far be it for me to suggest there might be stock market manipulation, right? But it is in the left's best interest to see things like the stock market tank. They're wishing for it because they're going to use that as a campaign issue to try and take the House and the Senate at the midterm elections in 2 years, in 1 year now, and to try and retake the presidency in the next presidential election as well. We talked about Steak and Shake a little bit at the first part of this podcast. But one of the reasons I follow Steak and Shake is not just because they switched to real butter and to beef tallow, but because they have teased multiple times now that they're going to start accepting Bitcoin soon. And they haven't specifically said they're going to or when they're going to, but some of their replies have implied that it's going to be really soon. And some of their more recent tweets, they've been signing the bottom of their tweets, Steak Toshi, as in Satoshi Nakamoto. And today, about 10 or 11 hours ago, in a reply to a tweet about their French fries, they even quoted Satoshi Nakamoto. I guess it was a person that said that they grabbed the beef tallow fries and they're waiting to pay in Bitcoin. And Steak and Shake replied, I get you, 2 hearts. If others don't believe it or don't get it, I don't have time to try and convince them. Sorry. Steak Toshi. So we have Steak and Shake quoting Satoshi Nakamoto now in their tweets, signing their tweets as Steak Toshi. That makes me bullish AF when it comes to businesses finally reaching that holy grail of allowing you to purchase your coffee, or in this case, your burger and fries with Bitcoin. And so keep your eyes open. I don't know when it's going to happen, but I have a feeling it's going to be soon. And I will be there to buy a double steak burger and some beef tallow fries, and to pay in Bitcoin, even if I use Strike, or at least spend and replace, because I want to support as many Bitcoin businesses as possible. Speaking of Trump and speaking of Bitcoin and Bitcoin businesses, Hut 8 announced yesterday, I guess 2 days ago now, that they are forming a partnership with Eric Trump and Donald Trump Jr. to launch a Bitcoin mining company called American Bitcoin. And reading into their press release. It says, I'll just read the press release. It says, Miami, March 31st, 2025. Hut 8, an energy infrastructure platform integrating power, digital infrastructure, and compute at scale to fuel next-generation energy-intensive use cases such as Bitcoin mining and high-performance computing, today announced the launch of American Bitcoin Corp, a majority-owned subsidiary of Hut 8, focused exclusively on industrial-scale Bitcoin mining and strategic Bitcoin reserve development. So that's cool. Not only are they going to do this new Bitcoin mining spinoff, which kind of, I'm going to continue the press release in a minute, isn't really anything new, but the Bitcoin reserve, strategic reserve, is new and exciting. Another company getting into the Michael Saylor play. And it's always been really surprising, especially companies like Coinbase, who hold very little Bitcoin, and that's their bread and butter, or mining companies like, Mara holds Bitcoin now, but they didn't used to. All the big mining companies, were selling every Bitcoin that they mined, or keeping it in reserve for the purposes of selling it to pay bills, during the down part of the upcoming cycles. But the fact of the matter is they were dumping their Bitcoin and not trying to hoard it all. And that seems to be changing. And most recently now with Hut 8, the press release continues, though. The launch of American Bitcoin follows the strategic contribution of substantially all of Hut 8's ASIC miners to and in exchange for majority interest in American Data Centers, Inc., a company formed by a group of investors including Eric Trump and Donald Trump Jr. In connection with the transaction, American Data Centers, Inc. has subsequently renamed and relaunched as American Bitcoin. So they are basically not launching a new mining operation. They were already in the mining business. They're just rebranding. But I think the fact that they announced that they're establishing a strategic Bitcoin reserve is the exciting portion of that announcement. Eric Trump commented about Bitcoin and what made him become interested in Bitcoin on CNBC today, when he said that the reason that he moved into Bitcoin was after his family businesses became, quote, the most canceled company, end quote. And if you remember, besides banning the Trumps from Twitter, or President Trump from Twitter, and going after him aggressively in criminal and civil courts, many of his companies' contracts were rugged. He had big contracts to run different vendors and events in like New York City, for example. And those contracts were all just pulled and given to other people. And even Capital One debanked his companies. I think he had 300 checking accounts for his different companies that were revoked by Capital One. So, RFK Jr. said he came to Bitcoin when he saw the Canadian truckers, and he realized that they could just turn your banking system off when you became an enemy of the state with the flip of a switch. And it seems like that's a similar concept with Eric Trump, at least, if you can believe what he says. And I don't have any reason not to. He doesn't have any reason to make up his Bitcoin story. Maybe he did, but the point being, it makes sense. One other piece of positive news before we move on, and that is, remember, the states are still marching forward with their strategic Bitcoin reserve laws. And it looks like Arizona is near the front of the pack now, with this afternoon their House committee, and I guess it says the House Committee of the Whole, passing the Bitcoin reserve bill. So now they're on to a third reading, followed by a final House vote, which would be the last step before the Bitcoin strategic reserve bill will make it to Governor Katie Hobbs' desk. Whether or not she signs it is up in the air, because she's a Democrat and she has a House and Senate in Arizona that are solidly Republican, and she has a habit of vetoing everything they send to her. But either way, the states are moving forward on in terms of Bitcoin legislation and putting states on a Bitcoin standard. And Arizona looks like they're taking the lead, with Texas hot on their heels. All right, on to what makes today and every Wednesday special, and that is that today is DCA Wednesday. What is DCA Wednesday, you might ask? Well, DCA is short for dollar cost averaging. And dollar cost averaging is an investment strategy where you invest your money in equal portions at regular intervals, regardless of price. For example, we set our equal portion at just $20 US. I wanted to keep it simple and relatable for the largest number of people possible. And I also wanted to show that even if you only have as little as $20 US to stack every week, that over time you will still build an appreciable stack of Bitcoin. I believe we've done so. And we chose weekly for our regular interval, once a week on Wednesdays to be specific. This will be our 193rd stack. We started stacking all the way back on Wednesday, July 28th, 2021. In the 192 ensuing Wednesdays, we've now converted a total of $3,840 US, just $20 a week, into an impressive stack of 10,524,078 Satoshis. 10 million sats being 0.1 Bitcoin, which might not seem like a lot, but that's pushing $10,000 worth of Bitcoin, about $9,000 worth of Bitcoin at this point. And we did so by converting only $3,840 US into Bitcoin. So that is not too shabby. That gives us an average purchase price of $36,487.76. So even with Bitcoin, quote unquote, crashing down to 82,000, that is still less than half of the current price. The 36,487, we paid less than half the current US dollar value for our stack of Bitcoin. To grow today's stack as usual, I'm going to use the handy dandy Cash App. Cash App is not a sponsor of this podcast, but you know I love them because I think they're the easiest way to stack small amounts. And there's some other benefits that I've spoken about numerously. But again, this is a you do you thing. They are not a sponsor of the podcast. It really doesn't matter what app or what exchange you use to stack Bitcoin, as long as you choose one of the known reputable exchanges, not some weird exchange nobody's ever heard of that you heard about on Reddit, and that you get that Bitcoin off of the exchange as fast as possible, because even if it's a reputable exchange, you know, they could get hacked, or maybe they go something we don't know and they go out of business, but none of that matters if they don't hold your Bitcoin for you. So you do you. Pick an app that you feel meets your needs the best, that's available where you're at. We're going to use Cash App. So as usual, this time I actually not as usual, once again, I have money already on Cash App, exactly $20 to be exact. I left it there because I knew Wednesday was coming up. So it's just a matter of opening the Bitcoin tab, tapping the buy button, entering $20, and tapping confirm, and boom, just like that, we've stacked another 23,639 sats, significantly more than the 19,000 sats we were stacking back when Bitcoin was over $100,000 a Bitcoin. So that is cool. That brings our total stack up to 10,547,717 sats. It does raise our average purchase price by a little more than $100 now to $36,595.60. Still significantly less than half of what Bitcoin's current value is. So that's a win for dollar cost averaging there as well. But perhaps more importantly, when Bitcoin reclaims that $10,000 mark, our current stack of sats will have a US dollar value of $10,547.71, significantly more than the $3,860 US dollars we've now converted. When Bitcoin finally hits that $1 million mark, that same stack, without adding another Satoshi, will be worth a $105,477.17, an absolutely mind-blowing return for just $3,860 US dollars. Of course, Adam Back thinks that Bitcoin will hit $10 million or more this cycle, and if he is correct, one Bitcoin worth $10 million would make our stack worth $1,054,717 US dollars. I have no idea when that will happen, but I do know that it will eventually happen. And Fidelity's Jerry and Timmer back in 2022, remember they said that one Bitcoin will be worth 1 billion US dollars by the year 2038. I believe they said even in inflation adjusted terms. If and when that happens, our stack, without stacking another single Satoshi, would be worth $105,471,700 US dollars. Almost difficult to even comprehend, but that would solidly put us in the category of all those stories you read. You know, you used to read in 2018 about the whiz kid who took his $1,000 his grandma gave him and he rolled it into a Bitcoin, and now he's got more than 100 million US dollars. And as unlikely as it seemed, and as amazing as that seemed, without lifting a finger to convert a single extra Satoshi, we will be in that same boat if Bitcoin reaches $1 billion one day. And of course, we are going to continue to stack at least $20 every Wednesday until people are no longer willing to trade us paper money for the world's hardest asset. But before we go, I do want to ask you to help feed that algorithm monster, to help promote this podcast by sharing this episode with your friends and family. You can also help spread the word by rating or reviewing this episode. and making sure that you're subscribed to the podcast and that you have automatic downloads enabled, for example, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts. You can also help support the podcast indirectly by following us on Twitter. If you follow us on Twitter at BTC Bulletin Pod, that's at BTC Bulletin Pod, you will help it be more likely that people will see our posts, that they'll learn about this podcast. Maybe you'll help Orange Pill a complete and total stranger just by clicking follow on Twitter. Of course, I also love to hear from you. The boosts are really cool, but also I do have my DMs open at BTC Bulletin Pod. I read my DMs and I do respond if they're Bitcoin related, not just people trying to scam you. Of course, if you don't have Twitter, you can always send me a good old-fashioned email. The email is bitcoinbulletin@protonmail.com. That's bitcoinbulletin@protonmail.com. Of course, don't forget to join us next Wednesday while we continue our DCA Wednesday journey. But until that time, don't forget to keep on stacking those sats, you sexy sat stackers.